Can I now ask Nick Haygarth to come up? Nick's about the same height as me, so I'll leave the microphone as it is. Just round this way, Nick. Just a check.
That's terrific.
Good to you.
Thanks, Ray. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks, Ray, for doing those acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and elders past, present and emerging. And I'm going to acknowledge Sid and Bron, Sidebottom. Sid will always be a VIP for me. It was he that suggested I write history, probably because he'd had the agony of reading one of my novels, and he was thinking, try something else. And yeah, so I couldn't write novels, and it's worked out quite well, writing history. I also just want to start off by acknowledging the great work here done by the children of the 4th Primary School, and Philosopher Smith, who was a great supporter of the 4th State School, would be highly delighted to see these wonderful depictions of him, amongst other historical drawings. I have just been to the Congregational Cemetery, which the 4th Lions Club keeps in a great state now. When I first went there about 30 years ago, it was like walking into a jungle. I thought it was quite appropriate that James Smith was buried in a jungle, because so much of his mythology is about how he forced his way through impenetrable scrub and walked for days on horizontal scrub. And there were comparisons to David Livingstone and Henry Stanley in exploring in Africa. It's a much more civilised place now. But the other thing that struck me about where he's buried is he's looking out over the Forth River. He's looking out towards the Forth River from a high point. And so were his compatriots, William Morgan Crosby and Joseph Raymond, all of whom had a connection with the Forth River. And I thought tonight I should just say a few words about James Smith's connection to the Forth, township of Forth, and also the Forth River. There are some wonderful images here in this exhibition, and those of you who have had a look at the exhibition, you may be aware that James Smith started life on the Tamar River. He was apprenticed as a flour miller at the Supply River Mill with Thomas Mons, his fellow apprentice. Mons had family here at Forth, and that was the reason that Philosopher Smith first saw the Forth River. He came down on holiday with Thomas Mons. And he returned here in 1853 after he'd been to the Victorian gold rushes. He put a down payment on 640 acres at Clayton Rivulet. And that was under what was called the preemptive right regulations. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what it was about was trying to stem the flow of Tasmanians to the Victorian gold rushes. Also, they hoped that some of those people that went came back, because this land offered under very liberal terms. You could pay it off over years. But because there was such a great timber market in Victoria at that time, because of building Melbourne, a lot of that land that was taken up was abandoned as soon as they took off all the timber, sold it to Victoria, and let the land revert to the Crown. So all they did was pay one down payment. That's what happened to most of the land that was taken up under that system. But James Smith was one of the minority who stayed. And it was a very tough life, because that land that was offered, it was remote, it was covered in trees. You had that heartbreaking task of ring-barking the trees, burning off the stumps, trying to plant potatoes in the ashes. And the nearest, most of your supplies came from Launceston by ship. Your produce went to Launceston. Smith had an agent in Launceston, and he started out, he was always well known for having an orchard, an apple orchard in particular, but he started out growing wheat on Westwood. And one shipment of wheat he sent up to his agent in Launceston, the agent wrote back and said, "Don't bother sending me any more of that, because that is complete rubbish. I can't sell it. In fact, you might as well sell up, because you'd be better off." So that was the attitude. It was a very tough time. Well, it's still very hard to grow wheat in Tasmania. But he didn't give up, and what he did was sell the right to 500 of his 640 acres. And he made £200 from selling that land. He had 140 acres left at Clayton's Rivulet. And he used that £200 to fund prospecting expeditions, because that's where his interest was. And he started off, he forged a route up the Forth River in 1859, over the Black Bluff Range, and he made discoveries of gold and silver and copper. None of it was payable. He also discovered wonderful stands of what was known as red pine, and that was a word that was used to describe both Kimberley and pencil pine. And what he was most interested in was the pencil pine that was growing along Pencil Pine Creek, because he knew if he felled those trees into the river, they'd eventually float down to the Forth heads. It might take years, and often it did. And he had a saw pit about, I imagine that it would be about where the highway now crosses the Forth River, where the heads are very narrow. Somewhere there he had a saw pit, and he must have had a bullock team or a horse to help him haul in the logs. Some of the logs came down in a flood, disappeared into Bass Strait, were never seen again. One washed up on the beach near what is now the Devonport Airport. So it was very hard to control getting the timber, but he was able to sell the timber as a building timber for internal and decorative use. So these are the things that he tried to keep himself going. And he lived in a two-room hut on Westwood from 1853 to 1874. When he mounted his definitive expedition in 1871 to Mount Bischoff, I think he probably took that dreaded road, which was known as the Plank or Slab Road, a dreaded road that was built from Ulverston to Castro. It was virtually a sea of timber floating in mud. And there are so many reports about the terrible things that happened to people that ventured out on this road. But it seems like it would have been an open road. It would have perhaps been better than a bush track. And he then would have crossed over the Black Bluff Range near what was known as Smith's Plains, named after him. And he had a hut there, a staging post. So I think he would have crossed the range about where the track goes up to the Devonport gold mine. And so he ended up in Middlesex. He wanted to try the headwaters of the Leven for gold, and he went from there to Mount Bischoff. So after that great discovery in 1871, he formed the Mount Bischoff Tin Mining Company in 1873 in Launceston. He married Mary Jane Love, and they moved to Launceston for about 18 months. And that was so that Smith could look after his affairs associated with the tin mine. And when they returned to Forth in October 1875, he moved into the house that's still standing down here by the shop. And that had been, Mary Jane Please's, as she was, her maiden name. Mary Jane, his wife, her father, John Please, had lived there. So they moved in there, and Smith never again lived at Clayton's Rivulet, even though he owned the land. So he lived in the house down here at the bridge, 1875 to 97. And I'm delighted to see there are a couple of photos here that were taken on the veranda of that house. There's that wonderful shot of Bravo, his favourite dog, who rescued him at Mount Bischoff when he'd run out of food, captured an echidna. There's a shot of Bravo on the veranda, and there's a family shot of James and Mary Jane and Leslie and Annie, their two eldest children. So at that point he became a popular hero, and there are many depictions, or written depictions, of Philosopher Smith philosophising in his laboratory or philosophising in his study surrounded by his books. So that was down here in that house by the bridge. And he was very community minded. I mentioned his interest in the Forth School. He was petitioning for a school as early as 1861. It took quite a bit longer to get it established. He was very interested he's a very pious man, and was interested in establishing churches and helping churches. He used to send cases of apples to ministers. Ministers, most of them had been at the Forth and moved on. So he was sending cases of apples to other colonies to try and help sustain some of these ministers that he thought highly of. So he was always community-minded, but it really wasn't until Edward Braddon turned up, one of the Anglo-Indian officers who, of course, became Premier of Tasmania and one of the founding fathers of Federation. And it was Braddon, I think, was completely bemused by James Smith. He couldn't figure him out at all. Smith was a retiring man, and just to give you an example of his behaviour in that respect, Braddon wanted to establish an institute, meaning a mechanics institute in Forth. Very difficult to do with a small population. But he and James Smith were two of the trustees of the hall that I think was built on this site, wasn't it, in 1880? And at one stage they even proposed to attach a museum to the hall, to the town hall. And there was a controversial Anglican minister at Forth at that time, J. Harris Wills, and Wills wanted to open the museum on a Sunday. Well, James Smith was having none of that, and he resigned from the town hall committee because he was in shock. You know, you couldn't do that, couldn't open on the Sabbath. So I think it was really through Edward Braddon that Smith was encouraged to not act in that manner, to rather than withdraw, to actually stand up for what he believed in more and in a public sense. And he and Braddon became a very powerful bloc in terms of petitioning, and in particular for petitioning for a railway and for roads and bridges for the northwest coast, and also in Parliament. Smith had 2 years as in the Legislative Council as a member for West Devon. So Braddon was a real agent in changing Smith's behaviour and making him into quite a powerful figure. He had enormous respect in Tasmania, and he was able to use that very much to the public good. So where am I going with all this? Well, I want to give you a rundown of his connection to the Forth. He wrote a lot. Smith was not a person who wrote a lot about his life, but he did write some of his recollections with those trips going up the Forth River and up the Wilmot. For example, there was one night where he spent in a rock shelter on the Wilmot River when he was out prospecting, and he described this amazing thunderstorm that happened, the extraordinary burst of thunder and the lightning that lit up the entire valley. And he also described looking at Winterbrook Falls through an eyeglass, looking glass rather, like a telescope from a distance. He wrote about the vegetation. He was always an amateur scientist, so he wrote about climbing over the Black Bluff Range and the Baronia citrodora, lemon thyme, the smell of the lemon thyme, and the pine stands of pine that he saw. He also wrote about his encounters with tigers. He wrote about 5 or 6 encounters with tigers. I'm sure he had more than that, but he never wrote, he never gave you everything. He was a private man. So he wrote about encountering tigers on the Black Bluff Range, and there was one at the Lee River and one in the Vale of Belvoir, one on the Leven. He always had dogs with him, and dogs were very handy to ward off tigers. He did fear, because he was prospecting alone, working alone, he did fear that lying in his tent in the open, he liked, in the warm weather, he liked to have his tent open. He did fear that a tiger would grab him by the throat and kill him. Also, he feared that a tiger would make off with his meat and leave him without food. So a dog was very handy. So, and I'm delighted to see there are 2 poems here, the 2 poems that he wrote about the Forth River. You can read them here in the poetry section. When he talked about the Forth, the river itself, he talked about it rolling onwards ever to the sea, and he compared it to God's eternal love. So, of course, that piety still came out, even when he was writing about the Forth River and about the township of Forth. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm really impressed with the exhibition. There's so many aspects of Smith's life represented here. The various properties, the whole of the genealogy is here. This wonderful work from the primary school, and this depiction of his study. The story of the study is so important. Edward Braddon said when he met Philosopher Smith that he thought he he was much more comfortable with his books than he was talking to people, because that was his nature. So I'm delighted to have been invited to play a part in launching this exhibition. It's a great pleasure, and I invite you to learn more about James Smith from this terrific work of the Fourth History Group. Thank you.
That concludes the speeches, folks, so just mill around, have a look at the exhibition and enjoy yourselves. So please go ahead and enjoy yourselves. Kevin and Linda, thank you for coming in.
Look at me.
You've just met after how many years?
Well, yeah, 55 or something.
Good. That's
A lot of work, isn't it?